I have to tell you, I did something like this in Canberra, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, picking out misunderstood words. But spiritual was not one of my original list. It's only occurred to me this year about the need for us to look at this word spiritual and to really understand it, because I think we use it in ways that are misleading. And we're going to talk about that today. What do we mean by the word spiritual? We talk about a spiritual person. We talk about a spiritual experience. We talk about a spiritual awakening. But what do we mean by these things? While I think there is some truth to our use of this word, there's a great deal I think we misunderstand. And what we tend to do, I was talking about the idea of the spiritual person in the children's talk. We tend to put a very tight box around them, as though this is a spiritual person, but something else is not. And I really want us to dispel that use of the word today. So I'm going to break our use of this word, and then we're going to rebuild it. That's the intention. So I want to say that there is no such thing as a spiritual person. There is no such thing as a spiritual person. We often think about a priest as a spiritual person. We might think of a guru or a teacher as a spiritual person. They are not. They are only a spiritual person to the extent that they are open to what is spiritual. And that's a very important distinction, because many people who are labelled spiritual people really don't fit the bill. And we have it in that story that we read, the story of the young boy Samuel and the priest Eli. You would think that God would speak to his priest, but he does not, because the message that he brings, Eli is not open to hearing, not directly. So remember about the word spiritual, what it is, how it's defined. It is an adjective. It describes something as spiritual, and it means relating to or affecting the human spirit or soul, as opposed to material or physical things. That's what the word actually means. Now, Swedenborg, when he uses this term, sometimes uses it as a noun. He talks about the spiritual. And what he's talking about is a level of existence or a level of life, an aspect of our being, and it's something that we all share. So we talk about ourselves having a body, and we exist within a world. And we can talk about that being physical or material. And this is the arena in which we have our actions and our experience. This is what happens in this physical realm in which we exist. But we also know that we have other aspects to ourselves as well. So we have a mind. And we talk about the things of the mind being mental. And they are quite different from what is physical. And this is the arena in which we have conscious thought and emotion. And then we talk about the soul or the spirit. And this is what we talk about as meaning spiritual, or we refer to as spiritual. There's a kind of thought here, I've called it subconscious thought, but it's also the arena of motivation. Now, what I do want to say is, I wrote this chart during the week, and the more and more I looked at it, the more and more uncomfortable I was with it. So, if you want any homework from this week, what I would say is go back and revisit this chart and try and find all the things that are wrong with it, because there's lots if you actually sort of sit and think. But it does get us thinking about what spiritual might mean. It so happened that Howard Thompson in Sydney released this video in the last couple of days based on the work Heaven and Hell. And it's a chapter in Heaven and Hell which is entitled, Each of Us is Inwardly a Spirit. We all have a spiritual aspect. And here's the first, or part of the first paragraph of that chapter. Anyone who thinks things through carefully can see that it is not the body that thinks, because the body is material. Rather, it is the soul, because the soul is spiritual. Since matter is not alive, only spirit, we may conclude that whatever is alive in us is our spirit, and that the body only serves it exactly the way a tool serves a living and active force. We may, of course, say that a tool works, or moves, or strikes, but it is a mistake to believe that this is a property of the tool and not of the person who is wielding it. So each of us inwardly is a spirit. We all have a spiritual aspect to us. And if we go and look at the Apostle Paul, he talks about the way there is a battle between what is inward, what is spiritual, and what is outward, natural or physical. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man, but I see another law in my members warring against the law of my mind. And if we go to the book of Galatians chapter 5, he talks about and contrasts the works of the flesh and the fruits of the Spirit. You can see this war going on within him all the time. So we all have a spiritual part, a higher part, and a natural part. We can all be spiritual people, irrespective of the job description. And what is it that determines that? It's not our actions, but it's what drives our actions that makes us spiritual. Okay, I want to talk about spiritual experience. Because again, I'm going to say there is no such thing as spiritual experience. Now let me explain what I mean. Because the bodily, worldly aspect of our lives is where all of our experience takes place. I experience things which are external to me. So when we have something like Swedenborg claims, which is to visit heaven or to visit hell, see people who are dead, all of those experiences, we might call them spiritual experiences, but they aren't, because they're actually something external to us that we are experiencing. And I think a better term for those experiences, near-death, out-of-body experiences, is actually supernatural. That is a better term to use, supernatural. So when Swedenborg talks about spiritual experience, what does he actually mean? A spiritual experience is something that reflects the state of my inner life. That is a spiritual experience. So he talks about the way that the environment in which angels exist is actually a reflection of their inner nature. That is spiritual experience, to see what is within reflected out there. So, for example, a couple of months ago, as we were working through Doctrine of Faith, we read this. Things in the spiritual world come from a spiritual origin. Everything visible in the spiritual world is a correspondence. That is, everything corresponds to something the angels and spirits are feeling. Another one, this time from Apocalypse Explained. For all ideas of the thought of angels and spirits are turned into various representatives outside of them. So do you see what's going on? What is within the heart and mind is displayed out in the environment in which one finds oneself. That is the truest form of spiritual experience. Now, what's really interesting is that when Swedenborg talks about hell, it doesn't happen in hell at all. Or they only get glimpses of it. And the reason they only get glimpses of it is the hellish experience really is a terrible one. If you want to look at it, I'm not going to read it now, it's Heaven and Hell, paragraph 571, which talks about this protection. And it's only people looking into hell can actually see what hell is really like. So the next thing I want to say is, although there's no such thing as a spiritual experience, like a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience is not necessarily a spiritual experience, any experience can be spiritual in nature. The only thing it requires is for what is within to be displayed out in the environment around us. That is truly a spiritual experience. And it does not need to be supernatural. You don't need to see a ghost. You don't need to visit heaven or hell. All you need to do is to see what is within you reflected out in your environment as you experience it. Now, Swedenborg talks about this being the difference between the spiritual world and the natural world. The spiritual world just does this automatically. It shows us the nature of our souls. The natural world doesn't do it quite so easily, but it can happen here if we are open to the experience. A secondary type of spiritual experience is one that draws our attention to spiritual realities. One that pulls us up short and makes us think about spiritual things, makes us take notice. That's another kind of spiritual experience, but I think it's a lesser one. And an example for me of this is Jesus' parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because in that story, he's reflecting on the inner nature of the priest and the Levite compared to their outer nature, and the inner nature of the Samaritan who goes about and doing the good that he knows he should. But then the last thing to say about it is that a supernatural experience like this one is not necessarily a spiritual experience at all. This is also the story of Samuel, for those of you who know it. After Samuel has passed away, King Saul is seeking Samuel's counsel. He goes to a witch who is a medium and seeks to speak to the soul. And so here we have, over on the left-hand side for you, is the spirit of Samuel appearing to King Saul through this witch. A supernatural experience. It's not a spiritual experience because the existence and the presence of Samuel does nothing to reflect the nature of Saul. It does nothing to reform him in any way. Do you see how this is a different thing? It's an entirely different order of experience. So just because someone has the opportunity to visit heaven or the opportunity to visit hell doesn't make them a spiritual person, and it doesn't make it a spiritual experience. All right, the last one I want to talk about is the spiritual awakening. This meme came across my Facebook feed last week or the week before, and I thought it was wonderful. Spiritual awakening. Thought it'd be crystals and peace. Turns out it's shadow work and ugly crying in the bathtub. Because we have this sense of what a spiritual awakening is. We think a spiritual awakening will be blissful. It will be wonderful. It will be visiting heaven and seeing its magnificence. But the reality, I think, is very far from it. You know, Christians talk about being born again. And you think about the way in which People who are baptised into the church are welcomed with open arms and it's a wonderful experience. But the reality to get there, I think, is very, very different. What Swedenborg talks about as necessary for a spiritual awakening is actually what he calls temptation. It is the difficulty, it is the challenges, it is the being awakened to what is truly within you and finding that you need to move on and change. That is the spiritual awakening. And perhaps we might say that the spiritual awakening leads us to follow the path to heaven. But the reality is that we do not enter heaven, heaven enters us. Do you see the difference? People who have heaven within themselves while they are living in the world enter heaven after death. Heaven must enter us. And only then, only when heaven is within us does heaven manifest out in our world. Okay. And what is the life of heaven? Again, I'm going to quote Heavenly Secrets. Angelic life consists in use and in the good deeds of charity. Angels in this way are images of the Lord. They love their neighbour more than themselves. And this is what makes heaven to be heaven. So I just want to finish with some practical applications of all this because it's such an important concept for us to grasp, but it's even more important for us actually to practice it. So the heavenly life, a spiritual life, is manifesting a desire to live from love and useful purpose. That's all it is. It is not at all about our external or physical circumstances or conditions. But I do want us to note the way that living a heavenly life can change the things that we experience. It can change the people that we meet. So it has its effect, but it begins in here. This is where heaven is. When we dwell upon external conditions, we are misled. So for example, I don't know whether you're familiar with the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel is that if you are blessed by God, you will be blessed by God materially and physically, and so you will be rich. You can see it's nonsense, isn't it? It's silly. So when we focus on what we do or don't have as determining whether we're spiritual or not, we're misled. In the same way, people can say, well, to be spiritual, you have to be poor. You have to give everything up. Or perhaps some people believe that they are persecuted and therefore they are spiritual. That's not the case. I also want us to take responsibility for our own inner landscape. The thoughts and feelings that you have concerning others and concerning your circumstances actually tell you more about you than they tell you about those others or about those circumstances. And that's an important lesson to learn, and it can be a difficult one to learn as well. So those observations we have about external realities, they're all about what's going on within. That's the real thing to learn. To know that our perception of reality is not the same as reality. And we can actually change our perception. We can change the way we look at our circumstances. And I also want to just say, let's also focus on use and love of the neighbour as worship, as sacred. You know, we can think of this that we're doing right now as being sacred or spiritual practice, can't we? But what I want to say is the care and attention that you pay to things like preparing the flowers, the tea trolley when we go and have a cup of tea afterwards, the drive here in the morning and the drive home on the way back. These are all just as spiritual activities, and they can be as spiritual activities as what we're doing now, and perhaps sometimes even more so. So if I'm going to ask you or challenge you to do anything, it is transform your view of the circumstances and situations you find yourself in, because every single one of them can be a spiritual experience. I want to finish with the words of Jesus. And remember who Jesus was. He was the embodiment of divine truth, and he lived a life of love and recommended a life of love. And I want you to notice in these words 2 sentences spoken in different ways on different occasions. I want you to notice the way he embeds the spiritual in what is ordinary, what is simple, and what is innately human. Listen to what he says. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. And on another occasion, assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me.